Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched 2018's The Old Man and the Gun. The Old Man and the Gun is a crime film, I guess. It's kind of hard to put a label on this film, for better or for worse. It is not in your usual vein of, action or drama, heist type of film. It is about old people for the most part. It has a reasonably star-studded cast, despite being fairly low budget. That being Robert Redford plays the main character, Forrest. Also includes Danny Glover, Tom Waits, Sissy Spacek, and a few others. Casey Affleck is not, not as well known, but a known name, and Tika Sumpter and a few others. Anyway, it is about an old man who is a career criminal and likes to rob banks. And that's about as far as it goes, actually. In a lot of ways, I was really getting the sense that this was going to be a character study of Robert Redford's character as an individual. But it sort of didn't turn out that way. And the longer I watched, the more confused the film seems to be. And the more I was sort of uninvested in it, or was losing whatever investment I had. So structurally, the plot doesn't follow any particular series of, like a series of heists, or even any particular series of actions, really. It's more focused on Forrest, Robert Redford's character. But it seems to frequently lose focus, whether it's cutting between Forrest and his adventures and the detectives and so on who are trying to catch him, which itself is sort of a structural issue. But it doesn't really seem to have a really good idea of what it's going for or what story it's trying to tell. Is there a narrative through line? Yes. I could give you a one-sentence summary of the course of the plot. But it really isn't the focus of the film. And as I say that, I realize that trying to discern what the focus of the film is really the crux of the problem, is that it is just so unfocused. The antagonism between the main character and his pursuers is not the focus. His personality is not really the focus. His relationships are not really the focus. Not even the history is really the focus, because this is pseudo-biographical based on a real person. So what does it do well and what doesn't it? Well, the casting is pretty darn good. Obviously, the names I've mentioned are all notable for a reason. Robert Redford, in particular, unsurprisingly, puts on a good show of playing the sort of charismatic old man that the character is supposed to be. I would even say that this might be one of Redford's best performances that I've seen him in, and not that I've seen a huge number, given that he has a rather prolific film history, but it's quite a good show. It's also notable that this was the last film he was going to make before his retirement. I don't know. He was, I believe, 80 years old at the time the film was made. So, yeah, and I think. Hold on, let me make sure I have that right, because I believe he's 84 now. So yeah, I mean, he was 81 or something like that. Anyway, he was in his 80s. He's an old man. And so are a lot of the other people who I listed before. And well, there are some films I can think of Redford being in where I think he does a decent job, but was maybe not the right casting choice. I think this was really great as a character who really works on his own personal charm, rather than his great talent. However, I feel like that whole narrative through line is really undercut by the lack of focus. It doesn't focus on him. It gives us examples of what it wants to tell us. So in his interactions with other people that are not in the course of robbing a bank, his other interactions also show that he's not, this isn't just a show he puts on. That's genuinely sort of who he is as a person. But again, it's just sort of examples rather than really giving any sort of nuance to him as a character or describing a backstory, or really having a good idea of the depth of his history, which is exactly the thing you would really expect something like this to focus on when it is talking about an old bank robber, right? There's a story there, a great story to be told, and it does very little to engage with that in, well, anyway, whether to talk about his history directly or to engage with it and how it's informed his character now. And I really put that on the script itself and the story arc. And it's not for lack of opportunity either. Forrest has a number of characters that he interacts with who has fairly intimate relationships with. But the engagement, while well written, the dialogue between these characters is well composed, but doesn't really do a lot, to the point where I struggled throughout the entire film to really feel like I was hooked, that I really appreciated the character for who he was. He's very much framed as a sympathetic character who the film wants you to root for. It certainly seems like, but it does so little to engage with the viewer, or to expand his character narratively in a way that makes you more invested. That I really feel like it was a squandered opportunity. Likewise, a lot of the other characters really should be a very, I mean, by definition, it's an ensemble cast, but it's not really an ensemble piece. A lot of the other characters' relation, like the existence and the on-screen time of the other characters, is largely dependent on their relationship to the main character, with the possible exception of Casey Affleck's character, the main detective who you're following. But even that's done relatively poorly. So the main character doesn't engage with a lot of these people in particularly deep or nuanced ways. And the characters, all of the characters, sort of lack a depth or a warmth that you would really want to see in what you would expect the narrative through line would suggest the type of movie this should be. Hopefully that sort of makes sense. in spite of all that, I don't dislike the film. I just feel like it was going for a whole lot of things and then didn't really execute any of them particularly well. Following the detective's storyline and his familial relationships and his relationships with his coworkers are so sort of surface level and in service of this plot that already doesn't have a lot of depth to it, that it's just sort of like airy stuff on top of airy stuff, nothing very substantive throughout the entire thing. And again, I didn't feel engaged with it. I could feel the movie wanting me to be engaged, and I felt myself wanting to be engaged and feeling the prompt to, but like there was nothing there. Nothing there to really hook onto. It's set in the 80s, and they do a good job in terms of, I mean, it's a relatively low budget film, only in the few low tens of millions, teens of millions, I think. And they do a good job of limiting the scope of the story, the number of sets they have to use, the locations and things like that, but they still do a good job of, having variety. That said, well, I guess I'll just get right into I mean, all the set dressing and the character designs and their outfits and things are all good, but I really have to get to the issue with the cinematography and the filming and the technical aspects of it, because I think it was a real misstep. This film was shot on Super 16 film, and it is apparent from the very beginning of the film, from the first real scene, that the DP didn't really have an idea of what they were working with. I actually went and read an interview that they did with the DP, whose name is Joe Anderson. And he says in the article, he says it in a much more, positive way, but he essentially says, I had never shot on Super 16 before, which is bad because, I mean, I've talked about some of the technical aspects of film before, and anamorphic lenses and film format, but it is readily apparent that the director or the DP did not have a good idea of how this film operates on a technical level, and so there is really, really hard film grain on a lot of shots, but it's not even consistent. It's not even a deliberate choice, because a lot of it comes down to not knowing. It appears as though they didn't really understand the exposure and the type of lighting required to get the shot they were working on. In this article I read, which I'm not even going to bother linking it, because frankly, it's just a little bit, it's fluffy. It's not really, it's like very congratulatory for reasons I don't quite understand. But the DP credits the colorist, which is like, yeah, I feel bad for the colorist because the colorist had to fix all this bad film. And don't get me wrong, like there's nothing inherently wrong with Super 16 as a film stock, or the cameras that they used, or any of these things. And even from a technical perspective, like there's an aesthetic here with this sort of muted coloring on this Super 16 film that is, it could be something, but it's not. And the technical flaws in it they're not distracting, especially for most people. They're not particularly distracting even to me, but it's like, why does this film look kind of gross? And again, it's sort of inconsistent to the point where I just sort of wish they had either not gone with that film, or gotten somebody who knows how to shoot on Super 16. There's lots of films that still get shot on Super 16 and lots of films that do good work with it. But if you don't understand the technical requirements of it, it's not going to go well. On top of all of the like literal technical problems with grain and color and lighting, and everything being very kind of dim the entire time, despite a somewhat upbeat story. In another failure, frankly, of the DP, every shot seems to be crowded for reasons I don't understand beyond the DP not knowing how the film shoots. Obviously, when you have certain types of film stock, you have to work with certain types of cameras, certain types of lenses, depth of field changes, all these other things that are not the same camera to camera. And it's pretty readily apparent that the framing, I mean, they, again, in that same article, they said a little bit to that effect, but were not apologetic or like saying they weren't competent in it. They were saying, oh, it was a fun challenge. No. It looks bad. There's a lot of framing that looks just a little odd. It looks crowded. The composition is just not that good. And that has a lot to do with not understanding how your lens distorts the what you're shooting. This Joe Anderson guy is fairly young. I don't imagine he doesn't have a lot of credits, and I'm not shocked that like everybody has to, you don't just go out and shoot Super 16 for fun to learn it, right? But at the same time, I can't get away from the fact that it doesn't look that good. It's not so awful or so distracting, but like, especially if I compare it to something like, well, it's not really fair. It's not a fair comparison, but I'm going to make the comparison anyway. Something like Zodiac, by one of arguably the greatest, director and DP teams of the modern era. I mean, but you're shooting for that same sort of color. I can't help but think this film was meant to visually have a visual style that is similar to Zodiac, and it just flubs it. I'm gonna basically cut it off there because I know that's not necessarily everybody's area of interest when it comes to cinema, but it's something that bothers me. And if they were gonna do everything the same and I could only change one thing, I guess I'd ask them not to shoot on Super 16, shoot on digital, because I think that's probably what the DP and the director probably have the most experience with. This was, as I said, relatively low budget. It's a team that is not hugely experienced. Largely, a lot of younger people. I don't think most of the primary names in the team are older than maybe 40. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But like, again, if you've got there are certain technical aspects that I think you have to learn with time, and it wasn't ready. Anyway, I'll stop that line of thinking. As far as, like I said, the narrative is it's not atrocious, but it's not that compelling. It's further chopped up by some weird weird edits, especially a couple of text titles. Well, let me step back actually. Again, I'm not sure about this Super 16 thing because they've got these titles that roll over the the main title, and then there's a couple of occasions when they put text on screen that is in the film print, but it looks funny. It's shaking on the screen as though it was, a very old style form of integrating titles, and it doesn't really do anything for the authenticity. It feels disingenuous, having these like it feels very hipstery, to have. I don't know if they did it legit the old way, or if they digitally added a digital edit after the fact to make it conform to their vision of this like 70s or 80s film style. And likewise, there's some like cinematography shots that feel like they're meant to ape 70s and 80s certain types of cinematography and camera moves, but they're not done quite right. It sort of hits this uncanny valley of cinematography, for want of a better phrase, where it's just sort of, it feels hipstery. I'm not sure how else to put that. I was starting to talk about how the edits were cut up, and so to get back to that a little bit, the text on screen, there's 3 points in the film when it does that. It does it once at the beginning, once about 2/3 or a little further through, and once right near the end. And on all 3 occasions, it's just bizarre. The first 2 are like, it's a plain black screen with text or a plain blue screen with text over it, and again, it's got that like shimmering effect as if the film roll is not centered right. And then the last one is over the film as it's running, and it's also on all 3 occasions it not only looks bizarre, but also like interrupts your sense of immersion, whatever you had. And I just think they should have cut them all out. There was no reason for any of them to be there. The content there it's not substantial at all. As far as that, the second one, that gets to another structural problem where I feel like there was a point at which I thought the film was about to end, and then it goes on for 20 more minutes. And this is not a long film. It's 93 minutes long. So that's not a good sign for a lot of reasons. It felt like it had run a lot longer than that already, which is not great in terms of talking about the pacing or the narrative. But then everything that follows that makes it feel out of place, as though that sort of break in the narrative should have either come much closer to the end or much further from the end, because there's a transition in the story that is important, but everything around it just doesn't quite fit right. Because the last 20 minutes really feel kind of stapled on. And whether it should have run for an additional 15 or 20 minutes to flesh out that portion, or that portion should have been excised entirely, I can't tell you, but it just doesn't feel right as it is. It's very weird. I don't hate this film. I've got a lot of criticism of it, but it's still like a 7. I try not to do that. I try not to give things numbers. It's not bad. Like, my feelings are on it don't add up to it, being offensive or a waste of time or anything like that. If you're in the mood for a kind of slow, quiet crime film of sorts, you could do worse. But you could also, well, I don't know. There aren't a lot of things in this sort of cinematic realm, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I don't know. If you had nothing to do for 93 minutes and just threw it on, there are worse ways to spend your time, but I don't think I'd go around recommending this one to anyone. It's weird. I heard a lot of praise heaped on it, and that's really why I ended up watching it. And I just don't quite follow it. Like I said, it's got some redeeming qualities, not the least of which is the cast, but it just didn't hook me. And some of those technical cuts, technical problems really added up to something I wasn't compelled by. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I will see you guys next time.